cases which don't involve bedroom encounters at all, so sleep paralysis would not be a likely hypothesis. There are many cases which don't involve hypnosis at all, so that's not likely. There are many cases, of course the original cases, which were long before the cultural script became widely known. So all of those things argue against the individual cases. But there is another issue which hasn't been talked about, and this is something that's referred to as the conjunction rule problem, and you'll have to bear with me for a moment because this gets a little bit complex. It's kind of a statistical situation, and actually it's used as an example of counterintuitive thought, so it's not that easy to necessarily follow. But basically it says when you're dealing with two or more coexisting and independently distributed conditions in a population, the proportion of the population for which both conditions obtain is the product of each proportion separately, and therefore is less than the proportion for each one alone. So in other words, if half, just to use made-up numbers, if half the abduction population had bedroom encounters and half had hypnosis, you don't add half and half and get 100% of the theory. You multiply half by half and you wind up with something that accounts for 1/4 of the population. And to be fair about this, if the variables are not independent, if they are inherently related, the best you come up with is a proportion equal to the proportion of the lowest individual factor, whatever that may be. So at face value, this approach seems to be more powerful and account for more of the variance, but in fact, it may not really do that. So I think that's also something that we need to keep in mind. Try to go through this very quickly. I know I'm running out of time here. But one of the arguments I think that we have to talk about is the idea of veridical memory. In other words, that the memories that are reported are accurate. People talk about the consistency. There's consistency in the sequential patterns with which events unfold, in the narrative details, and sometimes we're talking about really obscure details that are not widely distributed at all in the general population. We've heard about these markings and the scoop marks and so forth. These are the kinds of arguments that those who support the theory that the memories are real make. On the other hand, the evidence is circumstantial at best and it's anecdotal. This kind of evidence often is accepted in courts of public opinion, and we've heard that, at least in the past, they're sometimes accepted in courts of law, although a number of the speakers have done a lot to reduce that possibility. But really, in terms of science, anecdotal reports don't get you very far. So whatever your personal belief may be about this, it is quite understandable why the scientific community does not accept the hypothesis. The argument of recovered repressed memory, just to go through this very quickly, in addition to the consistency, some people who believe in the veridicality of the memories will say, well, this is just another example of recovery of repressed traumatic memory, but on the basis of some of the things I've already talked about, sometimes the memories are not traumatic, or at least not in the sense that we would normally expect. In fact, the more experiences that an experiencer has, the less they interpret them as traumatic. They're not recovered, as I pointed out in a lot of cases. They're intact memories. And there really isn't any psychological need for the concept of repression because of the fact that they're not considered traumatic. So they're neither recovered traumatic or repressed. And I'm, yes, look, and that just briefly said, and that we have the entire, pretty much what the entire day was about, all the theoretical challenges to the whole concept of repressed memory in the first place. So that certainly argues against it. So here are my highly controversial conclusions. Numerous explanations have been proposed. no theory in itself provides a complete explanation for various reasons. In some cases, the empirical evidence fails to support the theory. In some cases, there simply is not yet adequate research to address the validity of the theory. And in some cases, the applicability of the theory by its nature is inherently limited because it just doesn't make logical sense in terms of the nature of the phenomenon. So, I guess the previous paper was called Explaining the Alien Abduction Phenomenon. My conclusion is it's not quite ready for an explanation. And the most controversial conclusion of all is we need to do more research. Thank you.
We'd like to bring up our last group of panelists, and if you folks who've given the papers would be willing to come on up and join us too. When they come on up, Gail Beck and Bob Galgansky, Gary Klatsky, and Dennis Showers. We have enough chairs there? You get one more? That'll work. I'd like to introduce our panelists, if I could. Gail Beck is from the Department of Psychology at the University of Buffalo. Dr. Beck is professor and associate chair of that department. Her research interests include understanding the separate and interactive contributions of physiology, cognitive processes, and affect to anxiety disorders and their treatment. Dr. Beck has maintained an active clinical research program for many years, with a current emphasis on post-traumatic stress syndrome among adult survivors of serious motor vehicle accidents. Dr. Beck, would you like to stand up and take a bow? Bob Galgansky has his BS degree and his Master's of Science in Civil Engineering. He's employed as an engineer at Calspan Corporation, where he's a senior staff member in the Transportation Science Center, where he's heavily involved in crash safety research in automobiles. Bob is also a principal field investigator for the Center for UFO Studies and has developed an expertise in interviewing and investigating close encounter UFO witness cases. He also has been involved in actually using his engineering and mathematical expertise in evaluating the Air Force claims vis-a-vis the famous Roswell, New Mexico UFO crash, in which he's challenged the conclusion that the debris field found is actually that of a weather balloon. And we may hear a little bit about Bob talking about some of these expert witnesses. Bob, you want to take a bow? Gary Klatsky. Dr. Klatsky is from the psychology department at SUNY Oswego. He is the director of the Human-Computer Interaction MA program and an associate professor of psychology at Oswego. His research area on human-computer interactions deals with the increasing infusion of complex technology into our everyday lives. The study of human-computer interactions has emerged as a discipline concerned with the design, evaluation, and implementation of interactive computing systems for human use. And in understanding humans and their interaction, you must have understanding, of course, of cognitive psychology and memory phenomena, which Dr. Klatsky is also expert on and teaches in his classes on cognitive psychology. So if we could have Gary stand up and take a bow. Okay. Dr. Dennis Showers is the director of the Ella Klein Shear School of Education and an associate professor of education at my alma mater, SUNY Geneseo. Dr. Showers is responsible for developing and teaching undergraduate and graduate courses in elementary, secondary, and special education programs, primarily related to methods of teaching science and mathematics. Also responsible for advising students and supervising student teachers. One of his most innovative ways of doing this is to teach science education by addressing the UFO phenomena, as an example of proper and improper means of investigating science. And for that reason, we decided that Dennis should come and be on our panel here. Dennis, take a bow. Well, would anybody like to be the first one to hop into the hopper here and address a question to one of our panel? Yeah, why don't you go there, Gail?
Okay. I'm a clinical psychologist, so my question is sort of coming.
Still working?
I'm a clinical psychologist, and so my question is coming more from the vantage point of clinical psychology. I was really struck by data that both Rich presented as well as Dr. Appel concerning the lack of PTSD diagnosis amidst this group of people who presumably have been kidnapped. I'm not going to use the word abducted, I'm going to use the word kidnapped. And the reason I'm going to use the word kidnapped is that essentially alien abduction should fall into the rubric of somebody taking you against your will, right? Part of what I was wondering when you look at how we currently think about post-trauma problems is if you believe that an event has occurred that's been very frightening, that's outside of your control, that's criteria A of our diagnostic. That sets the stage for the collection of other symptomatology. And yet it's apparent that despite the fact that this group of people who believe they've been abducted have physiological arousal that actually exceeds what we see in combat-exposed Vietnam veterans, the rates of PTSD are remarkably low. I'd love to hear a little bit of discussion about that and why you think that is the case.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different factors that play into our findings that we're just not getting anybody meeting criteria for full-blown PTSD. We did have 3 individuals who did in fact qualify for subclinical PTSD, missing a couple of symptoms here and there, usually in the C criteria, the avoidance numbing criteria. But even in that case, it had faded over time. Point 1 is that even most people exposed to unmistakable traumatic events do not develop post-traumatic stress disorder. That's one thing that has become readily apparent in our field. So right from the beginning, there's a small subset that develop PTSD. Most people do not. Second, the issue about the meaning of the event, I think is very, very important. In the early days, we tended to see discussions of PTSD in terms of Pavlovian conditioning, sort of the behavioral theories. It's somewhat, I think, simple-minded in some respects. Those are partly true, but much of it has to do with the interpretations people impose upon these things. And what struck us in our research is that as terrifying as these events originally were, as evinced by the psychophysiologic profile you saw, today they've reinterpreted these things in a much more beneficial, self-affirming, indeed spiritual manner. And so it's drained it of its traumatic aspects, its mysterious aspects, and in fact imbued it with spiritual significance. So I think that's an additional factor that reduces the likelihood of getting PTSD. We did have 3 who did have subclinical, which would be around 30% or so, which is not too far off.
I have a change in direction. Listening to Eddie's presentation, he said that the whole notion of alien abduction started somewhere in 1961, at least the reported alien abductions. But you have to, at least I believe that there's some phenomenon going on with these people who are going to report it, and wondering if there's some way that they manifested it before, how they manifested it before 1961. And I was thinking even further back, could that be related to some possible religious experiences that people may have had in earlier times? That rather than reporting being abducted by aliens, you're reporting some religious experience.
There's a great number of traditions, especially kidnapped by the fairies, that has a considerable similarity to some of these cases. There's a a kind of missing time. It's called a supernatural lapse of time in fairyland, only instead of being lost memory, it's you spend a day with the fairies and, you know, maybe 40 years or 100 years have passed, or the Rip Van Winkle motif. But there's also the notion that the fairies can't reproduce themselves. They need human assistance, and they sometimes kidnap humans for that, which is exactly the same thing that the aliens are said to do. And then, of course, fairies are often considered diminutive. So there are a number of similarities. You could say that maybe there is a tradition, a belief, who knows, maybe some kind of cognitive category, something of that sort.
Anybody else in the panel? Bob?
One of the questions I have is that the whole abduction scenario just seems so utterly bizarre with respect to the fact that there are so many of them. You know, somebody cited the statistical the poll that was taken that there were so many people thought they were abducted, and I recall Dave Jacobs saying that they cooked the numbers to bring that percentage down because it was so high, it was ludicrous. I mean, it's not particularly convincing now because the numbers are still high, but the initial calculations had it up, I don't know, it was 5–10% or something like that, which translates to tens of millions of people. That brings into the question the logistics of doing all these abductions. You'd have to have like entire squadrons of spaceships coming in and getting people every night. And, that's right. That's right. And also some of the techniques, the procedures that are used. For example, Whitley Strieber described having a rectal probe, basically, you know, something like a reamer shoved up his rear end. And, you know, you would think that presumably if these people are coming to Earth, they would have something a little more sophisticated. Okay? And another one would be, you know, why bother taking people out of their bedrooms? Why, you know, or taking them out of the cars? If you want a sampling of DNA, well, just go and you know, just take over a blood bank. You have everything you want. You know, there are better ways to do it. You know, and there seems to be a contradiction here, and that in some case you have presumably advanced beings coming here, but they're using methodologies that in many respects are more primitive than what we use. Someone could try to explain that.
I can't. I will just make a point on the prevalence. I alluded to this a little bit, but the survey that's being referred to here was a different kind of survey than the one I referred to, which was a direct question: do you believe you have been abducted by aliens? The one that reported that there might be many, many, many millions of people basically said, have you ever had an experience of waking up and feeling paralyzed at night? Have you ever felt that there was a presence in the room, and so forth? And these were regarded as indicator items of a hidden abduction. So that data really stems from a whole different approach. But no, I have no idea why aliens would use primitive technology to probe you.
They're also capable of eluding 200,000 astronomers who've dedicated their lives to seeing these people come. But when they fly over Pittsburgh, they leave the Christmas tree lights on the outside of the spaceship brightly lit so that the plumber can see them. The picture of John Mack, was doing alien abduction therapy for a woman one time who, after a period of time, took her story public. She turned out to be a newspaper reporter who had hoaxed the entire thing. And I was at a conference in Seattle when she stood up in the audience and confronted Mack over the issue. Mack's response was that, in fact, he believed she was abducted by an alien and repressed it because it was so frightening that she made up a story that she was not abducted by an alien so that she wouldn't have to confront it. The issue is clinically For a clinical psychologist, you need to establish a trust with your client, and part of that trust is saying, I believe your story. Could either of the psychologists address the issue of how do you provide support or help to someone when you may believe that they believe their story, but you may not believe their story?
Well, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I actually did co-author an article with a clinical psychologist, which, and actually an experiencer was a third author of this article, which is how you approach these things therapeutically. And of course, different therapists would have different views on how to do this. But basically, from the discussions we had with most therapists who were not committed to a point of view, was that you treat essentially the person's reactions without trying to convince them one way or another that their experiences are real or not real. In other words, the therapy would focus on you have an experience that we cannot know is real or is not real, but how are you going to deal with the consequences of the fact that you're having these experiences? And that was more or less the approach that the clinicians we took to talk to who were independent on the view had to say about it.
Yeah, the question was that we, in the first study, we had two groups of subjects, those who had recovered memories of alien abduction and those who believed they'd been abducted by aliens. I agree with you that the so-called repressed memory group does in fact have a false belief that they've been abducted without any sort of autobiographical memory of abduction, a belief based upon inferences on diverse indicators, examples of which I gave. Now, it was very tough to tell differences between those two groups, other than the fact then the repressed memory group had not had sleep paralysis. So sort of interesting. And so they were making an inference based upon not having this vivid encounter in the bedroom, which is our recovered memory subjects did. That, I think, may be the biggest difference. But I absolutely agree with your characterization. That's really a false belief rather than a false memory.
Thank you.
Eddie?
I'd have to question some of that. The fairy tradition is quite diverse. Oh, I'm sorry. His comment was that throughout history, images of certain supernatural beings have stabilized very quickly and thoroughly, and have become sort of a standardized model, such as might have happened with the aliens that we see. But I just have to question some of the examples. If you look at the fairies, they're not just diminutive. All throughout folk tradition, they're of all different sizes. Some of them are giants. Many of them are, normal human size. Many of them are animal-like. And then you also have the shorter ones, and then you have the very diminutive ones. It's a very varied tradition, and it's remained so throughout time. If you want to look at some artistic traditions, look at the devils. Angels are, you don't have a lot of choice in depiction of those, but with devils, there's a great deal of variety. So at least as far as the imagination goes, as long as there's some freedom with it, the human imagination will provide all kinds of examples. And I would think that that could be done as well with the aliens, because you have so many examples. You have Hollywood showing a different one in nearly every movie. It just seems hard to imagine that the diminutive, large-eyed alien would have so perfectly organized itself as a belief as early as it did, when there weren't many, even prior to 1977, before there was any major depiction that, that everybody would have seen. Just an opinion, of course, but it just seems peculiar to me.
More question? Question? This lady over here, back there. Anybody want to handle that?
Yeah, I think you've asked two questions. One, might other kinds of sleep anomalies account for alien abductions, and has anyone looked at that, is the second question. In regard to the first, might other kinds of sleep anomalies account for it? Yes, they might. The problem is the answer to the second question. Has anyone looked at this? Not that I'm aware of. I've gone and called up sleep labs and asked directors of sleep labs who have done surveys of the content of individuals who are in the sleep lab because of sleep problems, sleep apnea or other kinds of related sleep problems, and asked them whether they have ever, whether they get with any frequency the kinds of stories that we hear from abductees. It's a very informal study, by no means a scientific study, but based on that informal inquiry on my part, I've been told they're not aware of any reports. No one I talked to had ever heard of one single patient in their sleep lab who had reported anything that sounded like an alien abduction. So that's the best I can give you as far as an answer to that.
Yeah, just a few different comments about, you mentioned Alan Hobson, and yeah, his views about dreams are certainly very different. I love this quote he's got about that interpreting dreams in the Freudian sense is nothing but a fool's errand, quote unquote, for the reasons you described. I asked him, he's in our psychiatry department, I asked him about the, Mac stuff, and it's all sleep paralysis, sleep paralysis. Just, that's his take on the alien abduction phenomena, Hobson's. I asked him, that's what he said. Now, the other people, We've done some other research on people with sleep paralysis, our group has. We have a paper under review right now. Individuals who had survived the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia now live in Lowell, Massachusetts, that's just north of Boston. And these are patients, okay, these are patients with PTSD and panic disorder, and they've got phenomenally high rates of sleep paralysis, in part because their sleep is absolutely a mess. In chronic PTSD, the sleep is just very badly disturbed, and anything that throws off the architecture of sleep boosts the likelihood of having a sleep paralysis episode, whether you nap in the day, work shift, have jet lag, what have you. And these folks don't have aliens. What they see in the bedroom are usually two different things. One are ghosts of the dead who were killed in Cambodia in the 70s. They're coming back to suck the souls out of the living who are lying there paralyzed, or the Khmer Rouge. So you see these different types of interpretations. So I think that, I think there's a cultural narrative. I don't think it's internal to the brain per se that is providing the consistency. I think it's a contact between the culture and the brain phenomenon that provides the consistency across the counts.
Well, at the risk of, conducting our own little sleep experiment here today, I think we probably should bring this seminar to a close. We do have a presentation, however, from our student, Tyler Page here, and Justin Higner.
On behalf of everyone here at NCCC, the Senate, the student activities, the student body, and especially the faculty, we would like to thank everybody for attending and giving us this broad and wonderful, enlightening experience today. We would like to thank the gentlemen here, Dr. Appel, Dr. Boulard, and Dr. McNally, and also the panelists, Dr. Galgansky, Drs. Beck, Hasley, Klatsky, and Showers. We also have some shirts for you from student activities and NCCC.